In this lesson, you will learn how to convert a quadratic function into graphing form. In the last lesson, we learned that if a function is in the correct format, then I can determine the graph of that function. Now there are times when the function might not be in the correct format, and I need to convert into graphing form so that I can graph. So there are different forms of quadratic functions. General form would be along these lines, where you have f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c. So for example, something like this, where a, b, and c are just numbers. So you have a function equaling negative 2x squared plus 3x plus 6. So notice we have the squared term, then the first power term, and then the constant in descending order. That is general form. But that's not helpful for us in order to graph. So graphing form, or completed square form, looks like this, where you have, just like we did in the last lesson, a number in the front times in parentheses x minus some number squared plus k. So for example, it could be f of x equals 3 times x minus 3 squared minus 4. So notice the difference between the two forms. And my goal in this lesson is to convert from general form into graphing form so that I can then graph the function. So here's the first example. You're given g of x equals x squared plus 4x plus 1. And our goal is to get this into a format where I have something squared plus something over here and maybe a number out in front if needed. This is going to be x plus or minus something as well. So this is my goal. And what I want to do is use a previous lesson on completing the square in order to make this happen. Because I'm going to force a perfect square to take place on this right side. So this is very much like completing the square, but a little different because we are doing everything just on one side and not changing the left side at all. We still want the function on the left side. So first off, if I want to, I can think of g of x as y equals. Same thing. And then from here, what I want to do is I want to kind of group together these first two terms. So I have x squared plus 4x by itself, and then the 1 over here on the side. And leave a little blank here with the 4x and a little blank out here with the 1, because I'm going to add or subtract something in the blank. So here in parentheses, I'm going to complete the square and make this into a perfect square. So to do that, just like completing the square, I need to take half of this number and then square it. So half of 4 is 2, and then 2 squared would be 2 times 2, which would be 4. So I'm going to add a 4 right there. Now this is where it's a little different, because normally with completing the square, if I add 4 to one side, I need to subtract 4 on the other side. Or sorry, add 4 on the other side. I do the same thing on both sides. But I don't want this plus 4 over here with the y. I want y to be by itself. So what I want to do is immediately subtract that back over, so that's gone, and subtract 4 over here as well to make sure it's going to be balanced. So instead of adding 4 and then subtracting the 4, what I can do is I can skip that and just say, okay, I'm adding 4 here, so I need to do the opposite, which is subtract 4 right here. Because if you think about it, I'm adding 4 and subtracting 4 on the same side. If you add 4 and subtract 4, that's going to cancel and be 0. So I'm really not changing anything. I'm just changing the way it looks. Okay, so I'm going to add 4 here and then subtract 4 over here. And now, in parentheses, I have a perfect square trinomial. So make sure you know how to factor, because this one would factor, and I would get x plus 2 squared. Okay, so x plus 2 times x plus 2, right? So if you don't know how to factor, make sure you brush up on that. I'm assuming you know how to at this point, however. So then, now we're in graphing form. We have it as something squared, and then a number over here. I can graph this very quick, because the vertex is going to be shifted to the right 2 because of this plus 2, or sorry, to the left 2 because of the plus 2. It's going to be going in the opposite direction. So it's going to the left 2, and then This negative 3 is the vertical shift, which moves it down 3. So my vertex would be negative 2, negative 3. We know it's facing up because this is a positive number out here. So it's going to look something like this, with the vertex at the point negative 2, negative 3. And I'm not going to take the time to graph this completely, but we've learned in the last lesson how to graph. So the goal here is simply to get this into the correct format so that I can graph if I need it. So this is level 1 difficulty. This is the most easy scenario. And then here is a more difficult scenario. So here we have f of x equals 3x squared minus 6x plus 1. So first off, make sure you remember that f of x, you can think of that as y equals. And then what I need to do is get rid of this 3. So that is something I need to do before I finish this. But even before that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to group together these first two terms. Right, so the constant term is by itself. So to get rid of the 3, what I can do is I can factor a 3 out of these first two terms. So I can factor a 3 out, and then I'd be left with an x squared minus 2x in parentheses. Right, because 3 times x squared gives you 3x squared. 3 times negative 2x would be a negative 6x. So I'm going backwards to factor. Okay, now what I'd like to do is I would like to add something right here so that this in parentheses will become a perfect square. Well, what do I add here? Well, I take the half of this number, half of negative 2, which is negative 1, and then square that. So half of negative 2 is negative 1, square negative 1 to get a plus 1. And then over here, I need to counteract that plus 1 with something. So you'd think, okay, you add 1 here, you have to do the opposite, so subtract 1, but keep in mind what I've actually added. There's a 3 out here in the front. So when I added the 1, in reality I've actually added 3 times the 1, which is a plus 3. So to counteract that plus 3, I need to subtract 3. So I have 3 minus 3, same thing as adding 0. Doesn't change anything if I subtracted 3 over here. So that's a little confusing, but that would be the process for doing that. So now I have 1 minus 3, which gives me negative 2. And then the parentheses can simplify. You can factor that. So when you factor, you get x minus 1 times x minus 1, or x minus 1 squared. Okay? And then this is in graphing form. We have the number in the front, we have this squared, and then a number out here at the end. And we can graph this if we wanted, where the 3 is kind of like my slope, negative 1 is your horizontal shift, this is your vertical shift. And we're not going to take the time to graph this one. My intent was to show you how to get from general form into graphing form. So that concludes our lesson for today, and we will see you next time.